Before the story begins, take a moment to settle in. What follows is a quiet, unhurried telling of the history of the NFL, starting in the early 1900s and moving gently toward the present day. You don't need to hold on to every detail, and you don't need to stay alert. Relax your body, let your breathing slow, and open your ears to the quiet history of America's sport. Part 1: Quiet Beginnings and Early Foundations. Era 1900 to 1922. Professional football did not emerge with a clear plan or a sense of destiny. In the early years of the 20th century, the sport existed in fragments, shaped by local circumstance rather than national ambition. Football was primarily a college game, rooted in campuses where traditions, rivalries, and rules had already taken hold. Newspapers focused on college matchups, while professional games appeared only occasionally, often reduced to a brief scoreline with little explanation. In this era, the sport lived mostly on paper. Many people never saw a professional game at all. They learned results through short recaps, regional columns, and word of mouth, which matched the league's modest scale and uncertain structure. Early professional teams formed where players already lived and worked. There was no standard model. Some teams grew out of social clubs, others from factory leagues, and many were simply groups of former college players who wanted to continue playing. Fields were borrowed or shared. Uniforms were basic and often inconsistent. Equipment varied from player to player. On game days, there were no ceremonies or formal introductions. The game began quietly, watched by small crowds who often recognized the players from daily life. The way players ended up on teams was just as informal. There were no drafts, no centralized scouting systems, and no formal pipelines. A team might recruit by reputation, by proximity, or by simple necessity. If a player had been good at a nearby college or if someone knew him through work, he might get a quiet invitation. Some teams offered small payments, travel coverage, or a job connection. Other times, a player simply showed up and played. Rosters changed easily, week to week, shaped by who was available rather than by long-range planning. Most professional players were not athletes in the modern sense. During the week, they worked regular jobs in factories, shops, construction sites, or sales offices. Football fit around their lives rather than defining them. Pay was modest and irregular, sometimes delivered after the game, sometimes barely enough to cover expenses. Still, players returned each weekend. The appeal was familiarity, competition, and routine rather than financial security. The style of play reflected this reality. A typical professional game during this period involved fewer than 100 total plays between both teams. Nearly all of them were runs. Forward passes were rare and often risky, making up only a small fraction of offensive attempts. Games unfolded slowly, with long stretches of running plays and short gains. Scores were usually low, often settling in the single digits or low teens. The pace matched the environment in which the sport existed. Safety in these early years was mostly a matter of toughness and habit rather than planning. Equipment was simple and inconsistent, and helmets, when worn at all, offered limited protection. Medical support was minimal. Injuries were treated locally and informally, and players often returned quickly because the sport had not yet developed protocols or expectations around recovery. The game's slow pace did not make it gentle. It simply made collisions feel ordinary, woven into the routine. Compensation followed the same modest pattern. Many players earned somewhere between $50 and $100 per game, if they were paid at all. Over the course of a season, total earnings often amounted to less than what many Americans made in a year at their regular jobs. Football was not yet a profession in the modern sense. It was something added onto working life. During these early years, a few players became known beyond their local communities. One of them was Jim Thorpe. Already recognized for his athletic ability, Thorpe's presence lent credibility to the early professional game. Even so, his experience reflected the limits of the era. Professional football offered no stability, even for its most talented players, and careers were shaped by circumstance rather than long-term planning. Thorpe didn't need a nickname because his name already carried weight. In an era where most professional players were anonymous, he arrived with national recognition. He ran with strength more than speed, absorbing contact rather than avoiding it, moving forward as if the field belonged to him. Early writers often described him less as a football player and more as a physical force, and that language mattered because it made early professional football feel legitimate, borrowing authority from Thorpe himself. As he once put it, "I never was content unless I was testing my endurance." Thorpe's presence didn't stabilize the league, but it made people pause and look. And in the same era, defense was not about disguise or takeaways. It was about standing your place. Cal Hubbard was the defensive counterpoint, the quiet wall. He was large, disciplined, and difficult to move. His value came from occupying space and refusing to give ground. He didn't chase glory. He ended plays. In the early game, that was the definition of control. In smaller towns and industrial cities, local businesses played an essential role in keeping teams alive. Factories, packing plants, newspapers, and civic organizations provided modest support, not because football promised profit, but because it served the community. Sponsorship often meant uniforms, equipment, or small amounts of funding. In return, teams frequently carried the name of their supporters. In Green Bay, Wisconsin, a local meatpacking company supplied uniforms and financial backing to a football team. The arrangement was practical, not symbolic, but it left a lasting mark. The team became known as the Green Bay Packers, a name that endured long after the original company faded from prominence. One of the figures who helped guide the team through its early years was Curly Lambeau, who balanced playing the game with the responsibility of keeping a small-town franchise operating. A similar story unfolded in Decatur, Illinois, where a food starch company called E. Staley supported a team made up largely of working men. The team took the sponsor's name and became known as the Decatur Staleys. After a short period, the team relocated to Chicago. The name remained briefly, then changed. The Staleys became the Chicago Bears, carrying their modest industrial origins into a larger city. Not all teams found continuity. In Detroit, a team known as the Heralds was connected to a local newspaper that helped organize games and publicize scores. For a time, the arrangement worked. Later, the team reorganized as the Detroit Tigers, but financial support proved insufficient. The team folded quietly, and its players moved on to other clubs. This pattern was common. Teams appeared, reorganized, and disappeared without ceremony. As more teams formed, problems became unavoidable. Owners competed for players, salaries rose unevenly, and rules differed from town to town. Fans had little assurance that teams would still exist from one season to the next. Quiet conversations began among owners, not about growth or dominance but about survival. In September of 1920, representatives from several teams met in Canton, Ohio. There were no announcements or press coverage. The meeting was restrained and practical. The group agreed to form an association called the American Professional Football Association. 2 years later, the association adopted a new name, the National Football League. The change did not bring immediate popularity, but it reflected intent. The league was meant to last. Part 2: Survival, Stability, and Slow Growth. Era 1922–1936. By the early 1920s, professional football had reached a quiet turning point. The league now had a name, a basic structure, and a growing sense of continuity. Teams returned each fall, and fans began to expect that professional football would continue. It remained modest and regional, but it no longer felt temporary. Even so, the way teams built rosters still felt like an extension of the earlier era. There were scouts in a loose sense, and there were relationships with colleges, but there was no standard system to distribute talent evenly. Teams that were more stable, better funded, or better connected could recruit more effectively. Players often chose a team for practical reasons: a job opportunity, a family tie, or simply an offer that felt slightly more reliable than the alternatives. That fragile stability was soon tested. When the Great Depression began in 1929, economic pressure reshaped nearly every part of American life. Businesses closed, unemployment rose, and discretionary spending disappeared. For professional football teams, the effects were immediate. Ticket sales were the primary source of revenue, and when fans could no longer afford to attend games, teams struggled to meet even basic expenses. Some franchises attempted to adapt by cutting costs and limiting travel. Others folded quietly, sometimes in the middle of a season. There were no farewell announcements. A team would simply stop appearing on schedules. During this period, the league did not expand. It contracted, shrinking to preserve what remained. On the field, the game remained deliberate. A typical contest now involved roughly 100 total plays, with the vast majority still focused on running. Passing was used more often than before, but it remained cautious, accounting for only a small portion of offensive attempts. The rhythm of the game changed little, and scores remained relatively low. Player compensation reflected the same caution. A handful of recognizable stars earned several $1,000s per season, but most players earned far less, often around $1,000 or $2,000 spread across a full year. During the worst years of the Depression, some players went unpaid for weeks at a time. Football continued to be a secondary pursuit, dependent on other work for stability. One player who briefly brought broader attention to professional football during this era was Red Grange. Already famous from his college career, Grange drew larger crowds for a time and helped introduce new audiences to the professional game. Even so, his presence did not fundamentally change the league's structure. Professional football remained financially uncertain, and most players continued to balance the sport with other employment. Grange earned his nickname the Galloping Ghost because of how he moved. Not through brute force but through momentum. Writers said defenders reached for him and found nothing, as if he had already passed through the space they were trying to occupy. The nickname mattered because it gave fans an image. The league was still forming, and Grange gave it something to picture. He doesn't run at you. He runs through where you were. He didn't fix the league's finances, but he showed that professional football could feel exciting. Defensively, the era had its own organizing presence. Before becoming synonymous with ownership and leadership, George Halas played defense. His style wasn't violent or theatrical. It was positional. He read plays early, filled lanes, and communicated. Defense in this era was about anticipation, not aggression. Halas treated the field like a map, and that approach later shaped how he ran teams and structured organizations. As the league became more organized, safety began to enter the conversation in small, practical ways. Rules were clarified to reduce confusion and manage rough play, not because football was viewed as dangerous in the modern sense, but because injuries affected rosters, ticket sales, and continuity. Equipment improved gradually, still far from modern standards but moving towards something more uniform. The league's approach remained simple: keep the game playable, keep teams intact, and avoid anything that threatened stability. As the 1920s turned into the 1930s, radio began to change how sports reached the public. Broadcasts brought games into homes and bars, allowing fans to follow teams from a distance. Coverage was still limited and uneven, but the effect was important. Football no longer depended entirely on local attendance. It could now be experienced as sound, a steady voice describing a steady game. The league responded to economic pressure by becoming more organized rather than more ambitious. Rules were clarified, disputes were handled internally, and scheduling became more predictable. These changes attracted little public notice, but they allowed teams to plan seasons rather than individual games. As the 1930s progressed, a small core of franchises remained in place. These teams provided continuity, giving fans a sense of familiarity. Professional football became associated with routine rather than novelty. Part 3: War Transition and a Growing National Presence. Era 1936–1950. As professional football entered the late 1930s, it had established a workable rhythm. Teams operated cautiously, fans expected football to return each fall, and the league had become a familiar presence. In 1936, the NFL introduced the draft. It was not a major public event. It was more like a quiet administrative step designed to solve a practical problem. If the best new players simply chose wherever they preferred, stronger teams could stay strong indefinitely. The draft was intended to distribute talent more evenly, giving the teams at the bottom first access to the next wave of players. In theory, it created balance. In practice, it created structure. It turned roster building into something that could be planned rather than improvised. The idea of scouting also began to grow more deliberate. It was still modest, but teams increasingly paid attention to college football as a pipeline. They evaluated players more intentionally, and the process of turning a college player into a professional player began to feel like a defined transition rather than a loose handshake. Global events soon reshaped the country, and professional football adapted once again. When the United States entered World War II, many players left to serve in the military. Rosters changed frequently, and continuity became difficult to maintain. Some teams relied on older players or those unable to serve. In a few cases, franchises temporarily merged to share players and resources. These arrangements were practical responses to wartime conditions, not long-term solutions. Football during the war years remained subdued. Attendance varied, travel was limited, and resources were constrained. Yet the sport continued. For many fans, it provided familiarity during a period of disruption, following predictable rules and schedules when much of daily life felt uncertain. During the war years and the years that followed, the league's relationship with injuries became more visible. Rosters were smaller, replacement options were limited, and teams could not easily absorb losses. Medical care remained basic by modern standards, but the league began treating player availability as part of operations rather than mere misfortune. Safety still was not framed as a public issue, but behind the scenes it increasingly shaped how teams practiced, traveled, and prepared. After the war, the country entered a period of transition. Players returned from service, rosters stabilized, and competition became more consistent. The structure of the game began to shift. Games now featured more total plays, often exceeding 120 per contest. Passing became a deliberate part of offensive planning rather than an occasional risk, even though the running game still dominated. One player associated with this evolution was Don Hutson of the Green Bay Packers, whose approach to receiving and route running hinted at changes still to come. Another was Sammy Baugh, whose versatility illustrated how professional football was slowly becoming more specialized while retaining its measured pace. Hutson's nickname, the Alabama Antelope, came from the way he glided rather than sprinted. He didn't overpower defenders. He separated from them. In a league still grounded in running, Hutson made the pass feel intentional. Defenders often assumed the ball would fall incomplete. Hutson assumed otherwise. That quiet confidence changed how routes were imagined. He made space where none existed. Hutson didn't just score. He redefined timing. And the defensive counterpoint of the era is a perfect reminder that early football stars often did everything. Sammy Baugh is remembered as a quarterback, but his defensive work tells the real story of the period. He intercepted passes not because schemes were complex, but because he understood positioning better than most. Defense in this era was still personal. You guarded space, not concepts, and Baugh thrived because he could see the whole field. Punt formation, but we're gonna pass. That line captures his mindset everywhere on the field. Compensation reflected this gradual professionalization. Top players could now earn several $1,000s per season, sometimes approaching $10,000, while average players earned less. Football was becoming more organized and more demanding, but it had not yet become widely lucrative. By the late 1930s and 1940s, radio became a stronger bridge between teams and fans. A listener could follow a game without being near the stadium, hearing the rhythm of drives, punts, and field position as if it were happening just beyond the room. It fit naturally into weekend life, and it helped professional football feel more present than its geography would normally allow. Television arrived more slowly. Early broadcasts were limited, and not every market could watch. But football proved unusually compatible with the screen. The field was contained, the action stopped between plays, and the rules could be followed visually without needing the full context of a season. Over time, television turned football from an event you attended or listened to into something you could routinely watch. The league adjusted gradually. Game times shifted, presentation improved, and commentary became standardized. Football entered living rooms and became part of family routines. Despite this growing reach, leadership remained cautious. Expansion was measured, and sustainability remained the priority. By the early 1950s, professional football had become a national presence, not through sudden popularity but through repetition and routine. It had survived economic hardship, wartime disruption, and shifting audiences. And now, with the draft in place and television slowly strengthening, the league was prepared for a louder kind of growth. Part 4: Competition, Expansion, and the Road to the Super Bowl. Era 1950-1966. By the early 1950s, professional football had reached a position of relative stability. The league had survived economic hardship, wartime disruption, and decades of uncertainty. Teams operated with clearer expectations, fans followed familiar schedules, and games were increasingly accessible through radio and television. Football no longer felt experimental. It felt established. With stability came confidence, and with confidence came competition. In 1950, a rival professional league emerged that would quietly reshape the sport. Known as the American Football League, this early version did not last long, but it signaled an important idea. Professional football no longer belonged to a single organization by default. There was room, at least in theory, for alternatives. A decade later, that idea returned in a more serious form. In 1960, a new American Football League was founded with the explicit goal of competing directly with the NFL. This time the challenge was organized, intentional, and persistent. The AFL placed teams in cities that either lacked NFL franchises or felt underserved. It offered an alternative style, both on the field and in presentation. The presence of a competing league changed professional football immediately. Players now had options. Contracts became more competitive, and salaries rose as teams vied for talent. Where players once accepted modest pay as a given, they now had leverage. The business of football became more visible, even if it remained restrained by modern standards. Competition also changed roster building. The draft still existed, but now it was not the only route to talent. Players could be drafted by one league and pursued by another. Teams competed not just in games, but in negotiations. Scouting grew more serious. Evaluations became more detailed. Building a roster became a form of strategy, shaped by choices, persuasion, and timing rather than simply by geography. Competition between leagues also affected safety in quieter ways. As salaries rose and careers became more valuable, teams had stronger incentives to protect their investments. Training became more organized, equipment more standardized, and coaching staffs more involved in conditioning and preparation. The game remained physical, but the league slowly began to treat health not only as an individual burden, but as something that influenced performance, contracts, and long-term stability. On the field, the AFL distinguished itself through style. Passing plays were emphasized more heavily, and offenses appeared more open and aggressive. Games often featured higher scores and faster pacing. While the NFL maintained a more traditional approach rooted in running and field position, the AFL experimented, offering fans a different experience. This contrast was reflected in the numbers. By the early 1960s, games regularly featured well over 130 total plays. Passing attempts increased noticeably, accounting for roughly a third of offensive snaps in many contests. The rhythm of the game quickened and scoring followed. Compensation rose alongside competition. By this era, top players could earn salaries in the range of $20,000 to $50,000 per season, while average players earned less but still more than previous generations. Football was becoming a full-time profession, even if financial security was not yet guaranteed. Several players became symbols of this evolving era. Johnny Unitas, playing in the NFL, became associated with a more precise and organized passing game. His calm presence reflected the league's growing professionalism. Unitas earned his nickname, the Golden Arm, not for flash but for reliability. His throws arrived on time again and again, even when the moment was heavy. He stood upright, surveyed calmly, and delivered. Writers described him as unhurried, even in chaos, and that composure defined the era. Johnny was the king of the last 2 minutes. He didn't rush the game. He waited for it. And on defense, the era had a reputation that traveled ahead of the player. Night Train Lane played defense in a way that became legendary and, later, controversial. He tackled high, hard, and with finality. Receivers knew when he was on the field. Defense in this era still used fear as a tool, and Lane embodied that reality. His nickname didn't describe speed or elegance. It described inevitability. You heard him before you saw him. In the AFL, players such as Joe Namath embodied a different tone, one that felt looser and more expressive. Together, these figures represented two parallel visions of what professional football could become. As competition intensified, the relationship between the leagues grew increasingly complex. Teams competed for players, media attention, and credibility. Contracts escalated. Television networks took notice. Fans began to compare styles, rules, and personalities. Media coverage amplified the rivalry. Radio still mattered, especially in regions where television access was limited, but television began to shape what felt important. Big matchups became national moments. The sport started to develop a shared audience, one that watched the same games at the same time, and began to experience football as a national rhythm rather than a local one. Behind the scenes, league officials recognized the risks. Continued competition threatened financial instability and legal conflict. While rivalry fueled growth, it also introduced uncertainty. Quiet discussions began, not unlike those held decades earlier in Canton. Once again, the central question was not dominance but survival. In the mid-1960s, representatives from both leagues began negotiating a solution. The result was an agreement to merge. The announcement did not eliminate competition immediately. Both leagues continued to operate independently for several seasons, but the future had been decided. As part of the agreement, a championship game was introduced to determine supremacy between the two leagues. At first, it was simply another title game, treated with modest interest. Over time, it would become something much larger. In January of 1967, the first such championship game was played. It would later be known as the Super Bowl. At the time, it did not carry that weight. It was one game at the end of a season, watched by a growing but still limited audience. Even so, the moment marked a transition. Professional football had entered a new phase. The league was no longer defined solely by survival or modest growth. It had embraced competition, adapted to change, and positioned itself for a future shaped by national attention. Part 5: Television, the Super Bowl era, and the modern NFL takes shape. Era 1966–1985. By the late 1960s, professional football had reached a moment of alignment. The merger between the NFL and the AFL had been agreed upon, competition between leagues was giving way to cooperation, and the structure of professional football was becoming clearer. What remained uncertain was how large the sport would become. That question would be answered not on the field, but in living rooms across the country. Television had been part of football's growth for years, but now it became central. Broadcast schedules stabilized, production quality improved, and networks committed to showing games consistently. Football proved to be uniquely suited to the medium. The field was contained, the action paused naturally between plays, and games fit neatly into weekend routines. Families gathered around televisions, often watching together, and football became a shared experience rather than a local event. The Super Bowl evolved alongside the shift. What began as a simple championship game between two leagues gradually became a focal point of the sports calendar. Early Super Bowls were treated modestly, but each year brought larger audiences and greater attention. Over time, the game itself became inseparable from the broadcast, the halftime show, and the surrounding spectacle. Football was no longer just played. It was presented. The shift from radio to television also changed how attention worked. Radio had invited imagination, letting listeners build the game in their minds. Television replaced that with certainty and repetition. The same plays could be replayed, the same players recognized, the same teams followed week after week. The league grew not only because more people watched, but because watching became a habit. Television also changed how the league thought about roster building. The draft, once mostly administrative, began to take on greater meaning. Teams and fans could see the sport more clearly now, and the future started to feel like a story that could be followed. A young player entering the league became part of the narrative. Teams began drafting not just for immediate needs, but for identity. They built systems, developed players, and started thinking in multi-year arcs, even if the language of the time was simpler than what it would become later. Television also changed how the league thought about safety. Hits that once disappeared into memory were now replayed and discussed. The game became more visible, and visibility increased scrutiny. While football remained rooted in contact and collision, the league's presentation brought a new awareness to injuries, particularly when players did not return. Over time, the league began to recognize that the sport's long-term future depended not only on excitement, but on how responsibly it managed risk. On the field, the game continued to change. Passing offenses expanded, playbooks grew more complex, and specialization increased. By the 1970s, a typical game often featured well over 140 total plays. Passing attempts now accounted for roughly 40% of offensive snaps, reflecting a shift toward a more open style of play. The pace of the game quickened, and scoring became more frequent. This era produced players who became closely associated with the league's growing visibility. Quarterbacks such as Terry Bradshaw and Roger Staubach came to represent stability and leadership at the center of increasingly complex offenses. Wide receivers and running backs gained prominence as offenses diversified, and defensive schemes evolved in response. The game felt more structured, but also more demanding. Bradshaw's game matched the feel of the 1970s. Big moments, big throws, confidence that arrived like a door closing. Staubach carried a different kind of steadiness, so controlled that it earned him the nickname Captain America, a name that felt like a television label and also like a promise. And when the league began to celebrate the full beauty of a running back, it found a player like Walter Payton, Sweetness, a nickname that sounded gentle until you watched him run. He moved with balance and patience, then finished plays as if he refused to be tackled on principle. Defensively, this era produced players who changed the mood of a game the moment they lined up. Some were famous for the way they controlled the line of scrimmage, making everything behind them easier. Others were famous for making quarterbacks feel hurried even when the pocket looked fine. These defenders shaped the tone of entire Sundays. They made offenses feel like they were always negotiating with force they could not fully escape. And in the middle of that, the league had a defensive face that television could hold onto. Mean Joe Green wasn't mean in conversation, but on the field he played as if the line of scrimmage belonged to him. His nickname Mean Joe captured intensity more than cruelty. He didn't need to make a highlight on every snap. He simply bent the game toward discomfort. He collapsed pockets, redirected runs, and made quarterbacks speed up their internal clock. Defense in this era became recognizable, and Green made it personal. He gave football a defender you could identify from posture alone. He made the entire offense feel smaller. As football grew more visible, it also became more professional. Player compensation rose steadily. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, top players could earn salaries in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per season, while average players earned enough to rely on football as their primary occupation. This marked a significant departure from earlier eras, when most players balanced football with other work. With increased compensation came increased attention to labor and rights. Players began organizing more formally, seeking better pay, improved working conditions, and greater control over their careers. These efforts unfolded gradually, often quietly, but they reflected a changing relationship between players and the league. Football was now a full-time profession, and expectations followed. The league itself grew more confident. Expansion continued carefully, bringing professional football to new cities. Scheduling became more standardized, rules were refined to balance offense and defense, and presentation improved. Sunday football developed a recognizable rhythm, with afternoon games followed by national broadcasts that closed the weekend. By the early 1980s, the NFL had become deeply embedded in American culture. The Super Bowl was no longer simply a championship game. It was an event that extended beyond sports, drawing viewers who might not watch football during the regular season. Advertising, music, and broadcast presentation became part of the experience, reinforcing the league's reach. Despite this growth, the league maintained a sense of order. Change came incrementally rather than abruptly. New rules were introduced carefully, and traditions were preserved where possible. Football continued to balance familiarity with evolution, allowing fans to recognize the game even as it changed. By the mid-1980s, professional football had completed a long transition. It had moved from local fields and modest crowds to national broadcasts and packed stadiums. Players were now full-time professionals, teams were valuable organizations, and the league operated with confidence and consistency. Part 6: Free Agency, Expanding Scale, and the Modern NFL emerges. Era 1985-2010. By the mid-1980s, professional football had become firmly established as a national institution. Television contracts were growing, franchises were stable, and the Super Bowl had become a fixed point on the American calendar. The league no longer questioned whether it would survive. Instead, it began adjusting to the consequences of its own success. One of the most significant changes during this period involved player movement and compensation. For much of the league's history, teams maintained strong control over players' careers. Contracts limited mobility, and free agency, as it exists today, was largely absent. Over time, this structure came under pressure. Gradually, free agency took shape. Rules evolved to allow players to move between teams under defined conditions. This shift changed the relationship between players and franchises. Careers became more fluid, negotiations more complex, and roster construction more strategic. Teams now had to plan not only for performance, but for long-term financial structure. As player movement increased, salaries rose. By the 1990s and early 2000s, top players could earn several $1,000,000 per season, while average players earned enough to rely entirely on football as their profession. Contracts became longer, incentives more detailed, and negotiations more public. Football had become not just a sport, but a business with visible stakes. The league responded by introducing systems designed to maintain competitive balance. Salary caps were established, tying team spending to overall league revenue. Revenue sharing expanded, helping smaller market teams remain viable. These mechanisms worked quietly in the background, shaping the league's structure without altering the on-field experience for most fans. In this environment, the draft took on even greater importance. Free agency created movement, but the draft offered something different, a steady way to add young talent at a controlled cost. Teams began treating draft picks as long-term building blocks. The best franchises learned how to draft patiently, develop steadily, and balance expensive veterans with younger players coming up behind them. Roster building became a form of planning that stretched across seasons, not just Sundays. On the field, the game continued to evolve. Offensive schemes became more sophisticated, emphasizing timing, spacing, and precision. Passing now accounted for nearly half of all offensive plays, and games often featured 150 or more total snaps. Defensive strategies adjusted accordingly, becoming faster and more specialized. Players during this era reflected the league's changing identity. Quarterbacks such as Joe Montana and later Peyton Manning came to represent preparation and control, operating increasingly complex offenses. At the same time, players at other positions became more visible, as television coverage highlighted individual matchups and storylines. Montana's calm looked almost quiet, which is why it felt powerful. He played as if pressure was simply part of the environment, like weather you accepted. Manning brought something different, a kind of visible intelligence at the line of scrimmage, the sense that the play began before the snap, with audibles, signals, and adjustments that turned the game into a live conversation. And as the era moved forward, a quarterback like Tom Brady came to represent the long arc, the idea that preparation, timing, and repetition could outlast almost anything. Defensively, the league now celebrated players who could dominate without needing chaos. Some were famous for making the pocket collapse, not with one dramatic moment, but with steady pressure that arrived play after play. Others became leaders in the middle of the field, reading formations, calling adjustments, and turning defense into organization rather than reaction. These defensive stars were not just tacklers. They were architects of discomfort. And in this era, that idea took a voice. Ray Lewis didn't just play defense. He conducted it. He spoke constantly, aligned teammates, corrected leverage, demanded urgency. His reputation wasn't built only on hits, but on the way he made 11 players feel like one unit. His presence turned defense into identity. The message was always the same: we will arrive together. In a league that had become faster, more spaced out, and more specialized, Lewis represented structure wrapped in emotion, discipline delivered with volume. Training and preparation changed as well. Film study became more detailed, conditioning programs more advanced, and coaching staffs larger. Football increasingly resembled a full calendar occupation rather than a seasonal one. The margins between teams narrowed, and outcomes were often decided by small advantages rather than raw talent alone. As football became a full calendar occupation, safety became more structured. Teams invested in training staffs, strength programs, and medical oversight. Rule changes began to reflect a growing awareness of unnecessary risk, and equipment continued to improve. The shift was gradual and imperfect but real. Players were now faster and stronger than ever before, and the league began adjusting to the reality that speed and force created new kinds of strain. Media expanded again in this era. Cable television multiplied coverage, highlight shows extended football into the week, and sports talk became a constant companion to the season. The NFL was no longer confined to game time. It became a running conversation, carried by broadcasts, analysis, and the steady repetition of familiar teams and familiar stories. And then, in a quieter way, football entered the home again, not through television broadcasts, but through something people could control with their hands. In the late 1980s and especially through the 1990s, Madden became a cultural extension of the NFL. It was not just entertainment. It taught fans names, positions, and tendencies. It made strategy feel personal. For many people, Madden became a way of learning football's language, the difference between a strong safety and a free safety, the logic of clock management, and the feeling of building a roster. It kept the sport present even when no games were being played. As the league's confidence grew in the 1990s, attention also turned beyond the United States. Television had already carried the NFL into homes across the country, and questions emerged about whether professional football could establish a lasting presence elsewhere. The idea was not simply to stage occasional games, but to build something more permanent. This effort took shape through a developmental league known as NFL Europe, originally launched as the World League of American Football. Teams were placed in cities such as London, Frankfurt, and Barcelona. The league was designed to serve several purposes at once. It would introduce American football to new audiences, provide playing opportunities for developing athletes, and offer the NFL a way to evaluate talent outside traditional pathways. For players, NFL Europe offered meaningful experience. Young quarterbacks, linemen, and skill players gained playing time that was difficult to find on NFL rosters. The league functioned as a feeder system, allowing teams to observe players in live competition rather than limited practice settings. From a business standpoint, however, results were mixed. While some cities showed steady interest, attendance varied, costs remained high, and long-term momentum proved difficult to sustain. NFL Europe continued for more than a decade, but it never became fully self-supporting. By the mid-2000s, the league made the decision to shut it down. The experiment had not failed outright, but it had revealed important limits. Establishing full-time overseas franchises required deeper cultural roots and longer timelines than expected. Even so, the league did not view the effort as wasted. NFL Europe had served as a testing ground, offering lessons that would shape how professional football approached international growth in the years to come. By the late 2000s, professional football had entered a new phase. Franchises were valued in the hundreds of millions and soon billions of dollars. Players were public figures, teams were major businesses, and the league operated with a level of organization unmatched in earlier decades. Part 7: The Contemporary NFL and the Future of the Game. Era 2010-present. By the early 2010s, professional football had reached a scale that would have been difficult to imagine in its earliest years. The league was financially secure, culturally prominent, and deeply woven into weekly routines. Games were broadcast across multiple platforms, franchises were valued in the billions of dollars, and the Super Bowl had become one of the most watched events of the year. With that visibility came new responsibilities and new challenges, and among them, none became more defining than how the league would respond to the long-term effects of collisions. One of the most significant issues of the modern era involved player health and safety. As the speed and physical demands of the game increased, long-term injuries received greater attention. Research into concussions and head trauma reshaped how the league approached rules, equipment, and medical protocols. Changes were introduced gradually, often quietly, with the goal of reducing unnecessary risk while preserving the structure of the game. These adjustments altered how football was played. Tackling techniques evolved, penalties increased for certain types of contact, and officiating emphasized player protection. The game became less about constant collision and more about positioning, timing, and control. Debate continued, but the league moved forward cautiously, balancing tradition with responsibility. At the same time, strategy became more precise. Analytics expanded beyond basic statistics, influencing play selection, clock management, and roster construction. Coaches blended data with experience, and the result was a game that appeared faster and more complex, even as its underlying rhythm remained familiar. Offensive football continued to evolve. Passing became central rather than complementary, accounting for the majority of offensive plays in many games. Quarterbacks operated from spread formations, receivers moved fluidly across the field, and offenses emphasized efficiency over force. Scoring increased, and games became more dynamic without abandoning structure. The modern quarterback became a different kind of figure. A player like Patrick Mahomes made improvisation look structured, as if the play could break and still remain under control. The best offenses now felt like systems built around timing and trust, where the ball left the hand before the receiver had fully turned. And alongside that, there were modern nicknames and modern reputations. Labels that traveled instantly online, debated, shared, and repeated until they felt permanent. Defensively, the modern era produced its own defining presence, players who could change the shape of a game without needing the ball. A dominant defender now had to fight through spacing, speed, and rules that favored offense. The best ones did it anyway. They disrupted timing, forced adjustments, and made quarterbacks second-guess what they were seeing. Modern defense became less about blunt force and more about controlled disruption, pressure that arrived on schedule. And this is where J.J. Watt fits perfectly. Watt represented modern defense, powerful, visible, and accountable. He played with the force of an older era, but under the scrutiny and responsibility of the current one. His preparation was part of the story. Recovery mattered. Conditioning mattered. His impact could be measured, replayed, and argued about in real time. In a league where offense is protected and space is prioritized, Watt still made himself unavoidable. He reminded people that defense could still be the center of attention, not just the reaction to it. Player compensation reflected the league's continued growth. Top players signed contracts worth tens of millions of dollars per year, while average players earned enough to support long-term careers. At the same time, the average career length remained relatively short, reinforcing the importance of preparation beyond football. The draft also became something different in the modern era. It remained, at its core, a system for distributing talent, but it also became a public ritual. Teams turned scouting into an industry. Interviews, workouts, data, film, and medical evaluations flowed into a single high-stakes process. Fans followed it closely, and the draft became part of the league's yearly rhythm, a moment when the future felt visible and discussable. Roster building, too, became a form of constant management. Salary caps, contracts, free agency, and player development blended into a continuous effort to shape the team not just for a season, but for the next several years. In earlier eras, teams were lucky to survive. Now franchises plan like long-term organizations, balancing cost, age, health, and fit with precision. Media consumption changed as well. Traditional television remained important, but digital platforms expanded the league's reach. Games were streamed globally, highlights circulated instantly, and fans engaged with football throughout the week rather than only on game day. In the modern era, the league's media presence became continuous. A game could be watched live, clipped into highlights within minutes, and discussed instantly across platforms. Football became something people lived alongside, not just something they visited on Sundays. And just as television once expanded football's reach, video games continued to deepen it. Madden ratings became a conversation. Players and fans argued over them, shared them, and used them as a shorthand for reputation. Online play, streaming culture, and digital communities made football feel present even in the quiet months. For some fans, Madden became the first way they learned what a playbook was, what a roster meant, and how strategy could unfold one decision at a time. International growth returned, shaped by lessons learned from NFL Europe. Rather than attempting to build permanent overseas leagues, the focus shifted to bringing the existing NFL product to global audiences. Regular season games were staged in cities such as London, Mexico City, and later Germany. These games allowed international fans to experience meaningful competition without requiring new franchises or structures. Attendance remained strong, and international games became a regular feature rather than an experiment. The league also invested in long-term development programs abroad, introducing football in schools and communities with patience rather than urgency. Looking ahead, global expansion remains one of the league's most open questions. The path forward appears incremental, shaped by media access, cultural interest, and routine exposure rather than rapid transformation. The story of NFL Europe remains part of this history, not as a failure, but as an early attempt to understand how football fits into a broader world. Despite constant coverage and discussion, the league has retained its weekly cadence. Sundays remain central. The rhythm of the season, the familiarity of teams, and the structure of the game continue to provide continuity. Professional football has traveled a long distance from its earliest days on borrowed fields and muddy grounds. What began as a modest local activity has grown into a carefully managed global enterprise. Yet at its core, the game still follows the same essential pattern. Players gather, the ball is placed on the field, and time moves forward in measured intervals. The future of the NFL will be shaped gradually, as it always has been. Like every era before it, the modern game will adjust, respond, and continue. And it will remain